himself was, even though that proximity was merely physical and unsupported by evidence or even by any theory. It would have been a great relief to him if he had known that Crewe's object in going to the gallery was not to mix with the criminal classes, but in order to keep a careful survey of what took place in the body of the court without making himself too prominent. Mr. Holymead, K.C., arrived, and members of the junior bar deferentially made room for him. He shook hands with some of these gentlemen, and also with Inspector Chippenfield, much to the gratification of that officer. Miss Fewbanks arrived in a taxicab a few minutes before the appointed hour of 11. She was accompanied by Mrs. Holymead, and they were shown into a private room by Police Constable Flack, who had received instructions from Inspector Chippenfield to be on the lookout for the murdered man's daughter. Miss Fewbanks and Mrs. Holymead had been almost inseparable since the tragedy had been discovered. Immediately on the arrival of Miss Fewbanks from Delmer, Mrs. Holymead had gone out to Riversbrook to console with her and to support her in her great sorrow. But the murdered man's daughter, who, on account of having lived apart from her father, had developed a self-reliant spirit, seemed to be less overcome by the horror of the tragedy than Mrs. Holymead was. It was with a feeling that there was something lacking in her own nature that the girl realized that Mrs. Holymead's grief for the violent death of a man who had been her husband's dearest friend was greater than her own grief at the loss of a father. One of the directions in which Mrs. Holymead's grief found expression was in a feverish desire to know all that was being done to discover the murderer. She displayed continuous interest in the investigations of the detectives engaged on the case, and she had implored Miss Fewbanks to let her know when any important discovery was made. She applauded the action of her young friend in engaging such a famous detective as Crewe, and declared that if anyone could unravel the mystery, Crewe would do it. She had been particularly anxious to hear through Miss Fewbanks what Crewe's impressions were with regard to the tragedy. The court was opened punctually, the coroner being Mr. Bodyman, a stout, clean-shaven, white-haired gentleman who had spent 30 years of his life in the stuffy atmosphere of police courts, hearing police court cases. Police Inspector Selden nodded in reply to the inquiring glance of the coroner, and the inquest was opened. The first witness was Miss Fewbanks. She was dressed in deep black, and was obviously a little unnerved. In a low tone she said she had identified the body as that of her father. She was staying at her father's country house in Delmere, Sussex, when the crime was committed. She had no knowledge of anyone who was evilly disposed towards her father. He had never spoken to her of anyone who cherished a grudge against him. Evidence relating to the circumstances in which the body was found was given by Police Constable Flack. He described the position of the room in which the body was found, and the attitude in which the body was stretched. He was on duty in the neighbourhood of Tanton Gardens on the night of the murder, but he saw no suspicious characters and heard no sounds. The evidence of Hill was chiefly a repetition of what he had told Inspector Chippenfield as to his movements on the day of the crime, and his methods of inspecting the premises 3 times a week in accordance with his master's orders. He knew nothing about Sir Horace's sudden return from Scotland. His first knowledge of this was the account of the murder, which he read in the papers. Inspector Chippenfield gave evidence for the purpose of producing the letter received at Scotland Yard, announcing that Sir Horace Fewbanks had been murdered. The letter was passed up to the coroner for his inspection, and when he examined it he sent it to the foreman of the jury. Then followed medical evidence, which showed that death was due to a bullet wound, which could not have been self-inflicted. The coroner, in his summing up, dwelt upon the loss sustained by the judiciary by the violent death of one of its most distinguished members, and the jury, after a retirement of a few minutes, brought in a verdict of wilful murder by person or persons unknown. As the occupants of the court filed out into the street, Crewe, who was watching Holymead, noticed the K.C. give a slight start when he saw Miss Fewbanks and his wife. Mr. Holymead went up to the ladies and shook hands with Miss Fewbanks, and to Crewe it seemed as if he was on the point of shaking hands with his wife, but he stopped himself awkwardly. He saw the ladies into their cab, and raising his hat, went off. As Mr. Holymead had seen Miss Fewbanks in court when she gave evidence, it was obvious to Crewe that he could not have been surprised at meeting her outside. It was therefore the presence of his wife which had surprised him. That fact, if it were a fact, opened a limitless field of speculation to Crewe, but in spite of the possibility of error, a possibility which he frankly recognized, he was pleased with himself for having noticed the incident. To him it seemed to provide another link in the chain he was constructing. It harmonized with Taylor's story of Mr. Holymead's decision to stay at Verney's instead of entering his own home the night Taylor drove him from Hyde Park Corner. Rolfe also possessed the professional faculty of observation, but in a different degree. He had seen Mr. Holymead talking to his wife and Miss Fewbanks, but he had noticed nothing but gentlemanly ease in the barrister's manner. What did astonish him in connection with Mr. Holymead was that after he had left the ladies and was walking in the direction of the cab rank, he spoke to one of the former occupants of the gallery. This was a man known to the police and his associates as Kincher. His name was Kemp, and how he had obtained his nickname was not known. He was a criminal by profession, and had undergone several heavy sentences for burglary. He was a thick-set man of medium height, about 50 years of age. Apart from a rather heavy lower jaw, he gave no external indication of his professional pursuits, but looked, with his brown and weather-beaten face and rough blue reefer suit, not unlike a seafaring man. The likeness was heightened by a tattooed device which covered the back of his right hand, and a slight roll in his gait when he walked. But appearances are deceptive, for Mr. Kemp, at Liberty or in Gaol, had never been out of London in his life. He was born and bred a London thief, and had served all his sentences at Wormwood Scrubs. For over a minute he and Mr. Holymead remained in conversation. Rolfe would have described it officially as familiar conversation, but that description would have overlooked the deference, the sense of inferiority in Kincher's manner. For a time Rolfe was puzzled by the incident, but he eventually lighted on an explanation which satisfied himself. It was that in the earlier days, before Mr. Holymead had reached such a prominent position at the bar, he had been engaged in practice in the criminal courts, and Kincher had been one of his clients. With a cheerful smile, Holymead brought the conversation to an end, and went on his way. Kemp walked on hurriedly in the opposite direction. He had his eyes on a young man whom he had seen in the gallery, and who had seemed to avoid his eye. It was obvious to him that this young man, for whom he had been on the watch when Mr. Holymead spoke to him, had seized the opportunity to slip past him while he was talking to the eminent K.C. The young man, even from the back view, seemed to be well dressed. "Hello, Fred!" exclaimed Mr. Kemp as he reached within a yard or two of his quarry. "Hello, Kincher," replied the young man, turning around. "I didn't notice you. Were you up at the court?" "Yes, I looked in," said Mr. Kemp. "There wasn't much doing, was there?" "No," said Fred. "He won't trouble us any more," pursued Mr. Kemp. "No." The young man seemed to have a dread of helping along the conversation, and therefore sought refuge in monosyllables. Mr. Kemp coughed before he formed his question. "Did you go up there that night?" "No." The reply came instantaneously, but the young man followed it up with a look of inquiry to ascertain if his denial was believed. "A good thing, as it happened," said Mr. Kemp. "I had nothing to do with it," said Fred, earnestly. "I never said you had," replied Mr. Kemp. "Nothing whatever to do with it," continued the young man with emphasis. "That's not my sort of game." "I'm not saying anything, Fred," replied the elder.